So let's talk about humoral physiology. We've spent a lot of time talking about the philosophical backbone that everything is built on, and how humoral medicine is a blend of Greek teleological natural science and materialist Hippocratic medicine. Now, let's get into it and explore how humoral physiology actually worked. And if you like medical history and ancient European herbology and formula uses, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, we're talking about physiology, so we're leaving abstract teleologic theory and moving into materialism. This means that we are going to be talking about pneuma or pneumata, otherwise known as spiritus, which means we have to talk about the organs and organ functions which create it, which means we have to talk about how the organs are created, which means we have to talk about the humors that create the organs, which means we have to talk about the food that the humors are ultimately created out of. And to keep it simple, we're going to be talking about adult physiology, which means you already have an active, unfolding process that can act upon the food. And that means you already have the calor vitalis, organs, humors, and pneumata. So we're kind of jumping right in the middle. So to start with, we're talking about the most basic building blocks, the things you eat, and how those things are turned into you. Because even if you have the teleologic design of something, without the building blocks, you don't have the building. So, how is food turned into you? How does the complete or incomplete conversion of food into you determine health and disease? First, we have to differentiate two different kinds of processes, and these processes refer only to the final product created. These processes are Pepsis and Genesis. Pepsis and Genesis are ancient Greek. The Latin for Pepsis is coctio, and Genesis stays Genesis because it's a technical Greek loanword. In English, we don't have a one-to-one word equivalent. Therefore, you see Pepsis referred to as concoction and Genesis is referred to as refinement. But in humoral medicine, we're not using these as general English words. We're using them as specific technical terms. The meaning is a little bit different. Coctio is the state of being cooked. Concoctio means thorough cooking, and this is bringing something to its mature, perfect state. In modern English, a concoction is a number of different things brought together and made into one thing. But this is not the classical meaning of the Latin word. To concoct, in the humoral sense, is to refine, transform, clarify, purify, mature, ripen, ferment, separate, and digest. It is taking a substance and turning it into something else. In humoralism, this is eating something, and by way of the body's innate heat and vitality, disorganizing it, taking it apart, and then reorganizing it, and clarifying it, and turning it into a different substance, and then sending that different substance where it needs to go for further refinement and alteration once it gets there. This is a complicated process happening across multiple organs and occurring in multiple stages. Pepsis refers to creation of gross material substance, like the humors and organs. It is metabolism, and metabolism is both catabolic, breaking things down, and anabolic, making something new out of those pieces. Genesis, on the other hand, refers to refinement. It is specifically a refinement that creates the spiritus or pneumata out of humoral blood. The spiritus or pneumata serve as the organizing and catalyzing forces of the body, not on an organ level, but on an organ systems level. Remember, on an organ level, the catalyst is calor innatus, and the temperature and moisture qualities of the humors themselves, which is essentially an extension of the processes of physical matter. So again, the spiritus here are the natural or vegetative spirit located in the liver, and that governs digestion and the creation of the humors. The vital spirit located in the heart, which governs the emotional impulse and distribution of vital heat in the body, and the animal spirit located in the brain, which is in charge of higher order thinking. Implicit within this is how the genesis process is the conversion of the material product of pepsis, blood, into the subtle material and energetic force of spiritus, or pneumata, required to actualize the body's functional potential. Both pepsis and genesis, concoction and refinement, create something. The difference is that pepsis creates a secondary product, a substrate for something. Genesis creates a final product. At least that is how I understand the terminology and how I use it, and I think it works well for our intents and purposes. Now, it goes without saying this is a 2,000-plus-year-old theory. Some things are going to be wrong. There are gross inaccuracies in basic anatomy and physiology, and the fundamental philosophical conceptualization of a human being as a sovereign individual and as a member of society is going to be very different. Therefore, in addition to anatomy and physiology, ideas of health and disease are going to be different as well, as is psychology. So we'll point all of this out, but also we have to appreciate things in their own context and in their own world. And after we appreciate things in their own context and in their own world, we can finally speculate as to what real difference any of this made in the actual treatment of the individual. Now, all of that finally out of the way, let's finally get into pepsis. There are 3 types of pepsis, and these happen in 3 different organs or tissues. First pepsis occurs in the stomach and intestines, second pepsis in the liver, and third pepsis in the muscles and tissues. In first pepsis, you eat something. It goes to the stomach, where it starts to be broken down, and this is by the help of a little bit of black bile, and the black bile provides a little bit of the acid flavor to stoke the digestive fire, and black bile also has a constricting energetic direction. So black bile is seen as the force that constricts the esophageal sphincter, which prevents food from coming back up. From the stomach, the digested mass travels to the intestines, where the usable is separated from the unusable. The usable is absorbed and the unusable is excreted. First pepsis is purely catabolic, breaking things down. And this is fairly close to modern digestion, at least conceptually, but with some key differences that we'll get into. Now, we made a point in the previous video on teleology of explaining the instrumental faculties and explaining they operate through the humors and the organs. This is important because ancient humoral medicine didn't know anything about stomach acid and enzymes. They didn't have that mechanistic understanding. It wasn't observable. You wouldn't see stomach acid on dissection. You would only see it when someone vomits or feel it with heartburn. In either case, it would be considered a pathology. You also, of course, wouldn't see enzymes working either. And because you don't have that, you can't observe that, you need a different way to explain what's happening on a microstructure, cellular, and molecular level, even if you have no idea what cells and molecules are. The instrumental faculties, when acting in the stomach and intestines in first pepsis, are how this is explained. But remember, we have 2 kinds of faculties, governing and instrumental faculties. The governing faculties are the animal in the brain, the vital in the heart, and the natural in the liver. And they work with the animal, vital, and natural spiritus, or pneumata. The instrumental faculties in the organs and tissues are attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion. Now, how do these faculties work together? The instrumental faculties are how an organ does its job. Attraction is the power to take something in. Retention is the power to hold onto it so it can be acted upon. Alteration is the actual act of acting upon something and transforming it. And excretion is the power to get rid of it or send it somewhere else. And these four instrumental faculties explain how food is broken down in the GI. But these faculties need to be coordinated, both in their own organs and across organs. Organs don't act on their own in isolation. They act under the direction of something. This coordination occurs by way of the governing faculties. And in regard to Pepsis, this happens by way of the natural faculty of the liver. The natural faculty organizes and coordinates the digestive process itself. It is a kind of organizing and driving force. It's similar to modern medicine. The stomach and intestines don't act on their own. They act through the direction of the enteric nervous system. So I think you could make the argument that the humoral, kind of sort of equivalent to the enteric nervous system, is the natural faculty located in the liver. And just like the enteric nervous system in modern medicine is vegetative, the natural faculty in humoral medicine is as well. It is the bare, essential, most primitive functioning faculty that requires no higher order or cognitive function at all. And it's interesting to note that many medical systems give the liver an influential role in digestion. In addition to humoralism, Chinese medicine and Ayurveda does as well. And of course, also modern medicine describes the functions of the liver as a digestive and metabolic integrator, producing bile acids, regulating carbohydrate and lipid metabolism, detoxifying absorbed compounds, and communicating with the gut by way of the enterohepatic circulation and the gut-liver axis. So a lot of different seemingly unrelated medical systems saying the same thing. Now, let's talk about the specifics of what actually happens. First, you eat something. Then the faculty of retention holds the ingested food in the stomach. Food in the stomach is acted upon by the faculty of alteration, and by means of heat, it is broken down. The humors are not involved in first Pepsis in the stomach, except, of course, as mentioned, for a little bit of black bile, which is there again to stimulate the digestive fire due to its acidity, and to close the esophageal sphincter. In the stomach, Pepsis happens entirely by the heat of the calor innatus and the calor instrumentalis, which are the same thing, just specifically in the stomach. So calor innatus means innate heat, the heat of the body, which is life itself, and calor instrumentalis means instrumental heat, and that is the heat every organ has as its own instrumental heat. So in this specific case, calor innatus is converted by the stomach to the calor instrumentalis specific to the stomach itself. And in doing so, this heat is essentially intensified to make it a kind of cooking heat. And through this heat, the faculty of alteration breaks the food apart by way of the cooking process. Remember, there's no idea of enzymatic activity, into a homogeneous, crude, nutritive fluid called chyle. Chyle is the in-between stage between food, which is external to the body, and the humors, which are internal to or part of the body. Yellow bile, black bile for the most part, And phlegm should not be present in the stomach itself. Blood should not be present in the cavity of the stomach either. And if they are, this is a pathology. So the humors do not have a direct role in first pepsis. They do, however, have an indirect role. And this is by way of, for example, the blood, which carries the calor innatus required by the stomach. Blood also supplies nutrition to the stomach and to the intestines to keep those organs vital and moist. And blood also carries with it the other humors. Remember that while what should be primarily flowing in the arteries and veins is blood, there is a small amount of yellow bile, a small amount of black bile, and a slightly larger amount of phlegm that also flows with the blood. And they don't flow in solution. They're not dissolved into the blood. Rather, they flow as an admixture. A healthy state is when blood is the most abundant, and the other humors are lesser and in balanced amounts. If there is that healthy balance, then there is good temperature, there is good moisture, and there is good tone of the organ and the tissue. And this good tone allows the organ and the tissue to do its job. In the case of the stomach, that job is to amplify the calor innatus to the calor instrumentalis for the sake of digestion. However, if the other humors become disproportionate, then the environment of the organs themselves changes, either by becoming too hot, or too cold, or too moist, or too dry. That means they can't do their job well. So if there is too much yellow bile carried with the blood, you can get a stomach that is hot and dry. If there is too much phlegm, you can get a stomach that is cold and wet. So the imbalance of heat and moisture will have an effect upon organ, muscle, and tissue tone. For example, yellow bile is like a flame on a stove under your cooking pot. And just like a flame under a pot, it has to be balanced. If the flame is too hot, meaning the stomach tissue itself has become too hot and dry because of a bilious constitution, then the food burns and bitter char is created. And I'm sure everyone has burned sauce on the bottom of a pan or overcooked something on the grill, and we know what that flavor and quality is like. This is chyle that is hot and burned. Being hot and burned, it becomes too acrid and irritating. And this leads to downstream problems of irritability, heartburn, digestive upset, etc., as that acrid quality doesn't just stay in the stomach, it starts to spread to other organs. And this can look like, in modern terms, inflammation or infection of the stomach or intestines. It can also look like a kind of nervous system overexcitation where there's too much sympathetic tone due to irritation of the nerves. This nervous tension then prevents proper peristaltic movement, mostly by speeding things up, or if it's too intense, by causing spasm. On the other hand, if the flame is too cold, then it doesn't cook and thicken, and the chyle is too thin and lacks nutrition. And this looks like fatigue, gas, bloating, low stomach acid, and lack of GI tone. And when we get into the spiritus or pneumata, this can look like brain fog and mental fatigue. Looking at phlegm, if there's too much phlegm, then the stomach becomes cold and moist. Or we could say it's kind of filled with a lot of cold, moist fluid. And this weakens its coctive or alterative faculty. So food doesn't get broken down. And this is like putting a heat diffuser over a burner to make sure that the flame is not too intense. And in this sense, the diffuser works too well. It diffuses the heat too much. There's not enough heat to actually cook anything. But in this case, the stomach itself, or the calor innatus, or the calor instrumentalis, isn't too weak, it's being blocked, and it's being blocked by the phlegm. Too much black bile, lastly, would create a tissue state that is too dry and rigid with no elasticity or suppleness, so can't absorb moisture, spastic, things like that. Importantly, these humoral states happen to the tissues themselves. So these are tissue states, as tissue states are created by the blood substrate that feed it and by the admixture that the blood carries. This is not yet looking at the accumulation of the humors in the hollow organ of the stomach. Now, why will an imbalance of humoral admixture in the blood affect one organ differently than another? This is because each organ draws to it different humoral qualities of the blood based upon what the organ, needs. And this is because each organ has a different base temperature and moisture, and so it has different strengths and weaknesses. And some organs are inherently stronger and some inherently more delicate than others. And also because each organ changes the blood as it passes it on to the next. Now, getting back to first Pepsis itself, the bulk of digestion happens in the stomach by way of heat alone, as we said, not dependent upon the humors. This, we need to understand, is a cooking process. And this is a good point to stop for an aside and consider how central the idea of heat was to life in pre-modern culture. Certainly, a common experience in ancient peoples was to sit around a fire and watch this mysterious flame move and twist and turn as if it were alive, and to listen to the crackle, pop, and hiss of the fire almost as if it's speaking. And in the darkness, with nothing but that rhythmic and hypnotic flicker, that flame is elemental, something on the border of life and death, the dead wood it consumes and the living people watching it, and also primordially beyond any of it. This ultimate transformation and consumption process, then as now, is a deeply spiritual metaphor. And in the dead and cold of night, with nothing but the warmth of the fire or the feeling of a warm body beside you if you were lucky, you could not help but appreciate that what separated life from death was heat. To an ancient person, really what separated a living being from a beautiful corpse was warmth, the fire of life within. And so when people became agrarian and began to cook with pots, it's only natural that the idea of internal fire was extended to specific processes of the body, in particular digestion. And living in ancient times, seeing food cook and break down in a pot would have been an everyday experience. And the heat process of stew cooking on a stove or fire reducing wood to ash would have explained the transformation of the food you take in and the waste you excrete. Another daily occurrence would have been seeing vegetables fermenting in a pot, or turning over a pile of compost and manure in the winter and seeing big billows of hot steam rising from it. People would have appreciated that that steam smells like a fart. And of course, they would have thought there has to be the same transformative heat process happening inside of them. And so they would have looked at the stomach as a big pot inside of the body for cooking or fermenting ingested food. And lastly, spicy foods, which speed digestive transit and thin cold mucus, register in the body subjectively as thermally hot. So another heat is digestive process correlation. So it's no coincidence that all three major classical medical systems of the ancient world, Greek Humoral, Classical Chinese, and Ayurvedic, described digestion as a cooking process involving heat. I think most, if not all, pre-modern cultures described the digestive process in that way. If you know of any that didn't, let us know in the comments. I'd be really curious to know. In humoral medicine, there was the calor innatus and the calor instrumentalis. In classical Chinese, there was the spleen yang related to the kidney yang. And Ayurvedic medicine had the most clear and obvious references to fire of them all. Jataragni, the fire of the stomach, starts the process of digestion. The 5 Bhutagni, the elemental fires of earth, water, fire, air, and space, then take over. The 7 Dhatu Agni, the tissue-specific fires of the plasma, blood, muscle, fat, bone, marrow, and reproductive fluids, then continue the cooking process. And Agni, of course, is cognate to Latin igni. Sanskrit and Latin are very closely related, and both Agni and igni derive from the Proto-Indo-European word for fire, inguinus. And of course I'm mispronouncing that, but nobody knows how to pronounce it. So this pure fire is the digestive process of the stomach, and the majority of first pepsis happens in the stomach. And the result of digestion in the stomach is the homogeneous nutritive fluid called chyle. So, summing up where we are so far. This pure fire is the digestive process of the stomach. And the majority of first pepsis happens in the stomach. And the result of digestion in the stomach is the homogeneous nutritive fluid called chyle. But first pepsis isn't finished yet. This chyle that's produced is still too thin to be useful. So, as it moves from the stomach to the intestines, where it will be absorbed, it goes through a final thickening and refining process. When it passes from the stomach into the duodenum, the gallbladder sends yellow bile. This yellow bile in the duodenum cooks and thickens the chyle further. The presence of yellow bile, with its refining and purifying nature, also prevents the chyle from rotting. As it passes into the intestines continue the cooking process, but this time with a milder heat than the stomach for the final ripening of the food. And while the heat of the intestines is milder, the attractive faculty of the intestines is stronger. So the small intestine is the organ where the nutritive substance of the chyle is extracted, or attracted away from the unusable waste. And when the chyle is the appropriate thickness, this same faculty of attraction brings it to the mesenteric veins, and from there it travels to the portal vein and goes to the liver. The waste is then passed to the large intestine, and the large intestine attracts the waste to itself, away from the body, so that it can be excreted. So, what this all means is that the site of digestion is the stomach and intestines. But the ability of digestion to occur by action of these organs depends upon the blood and its humoral admixture that built the stomach and intestines and continually nourishes them. We can think about it this way. An organ is a tissue with a particular form and a particular qualitative constitution. That form and constitution carry the potential to do something. That is its natural faculty. This is expressed through the instrumental faculties. Every faculty depends upon the condition of the tissue, and the condition of the tissue depends upon the humors. Therefore, all weakness of the faculties ultimately stems from humoral imbalance, whether that imbalance is internally or externally caused. Thus, if the end result of first pepsis is chyle, and we do not obtain good chyle, and we assume the patient's diet and regimen are in proper order, then the root of the failure must lie in the humors. The same applies when the blood is corrupted, or the pneuma or spirits are disturbed. These are simply expressions of an underlying humoral disorder. In humoral medicine, every intervention, dietary, pharmaceutical, behavioral, or environmental, is ultimately aimed at correcting the mixture of the humors, and through them, the constitution of the organs. That is why it is called humoral medicine. So that is first Pepsis, and the end result of first Pepsis is Chyle. Now, a quick aside. Chyle was inferred by Galen. It was not observed. Later anatomists did observe that there was, in fact, a lipid-rich, milky substance of fats absorbed from the small intestine into the mesenteric lymphatic vessels. And they did end up calling this chyle. But this is because the word was already there. They were not labeling the same concept. So the chyle used in modern anatomy is not the chyle as used by Galen in humoral medicine. Okay, so that's a lot of theory to digest, no pun intended. Now let's talk about where modern medicine and humoral medicine differ in important ways. Remember, this model was from 2,000 years ago, and anatomical dissection was nowhere near as refined, obviously. And also, what was being dissected was primarily animals, and those observations were extrapolated onto people. So, there are going to be things that are not anatomically or physiologically accurate. Let's ignore the humors and the faculties, because that's more of an issue of theory and philosophy. And instead, let's look only at some of the anatomy and physiology. First, humoral medicine's cooking that occurs in the stomach and intestines is conceptualized as cooking by way of temperature, as we said. And we now know this cooking happens by way of acids and enzymes. So we now know that this cooking is not a thermal cooking, but a chemical cooking. Next, the nutrient-rich fluid chyle was considered a single homogeneous fluid absorbed from the stomach through the portal vein to the liver. And we now know that what is broken down is not a single homogeneous fluid, but all kinds of sugars, amino acids, lipids, etc. Chyle was also considered to be the direct precursor to blood, and blood formation happened in the liver. We now know that the direct byproducts of metabolism are not immediate precursors to blood. We also know that blood production happens mainly in the bone marrow, starting with hematopoietic stem cells that divide into myeloid cells and lymphoid cells. Now let's consider blood specifically, because the extreme difference in description in something seemingly so easy to define as blood brings up an important consideration. It's easy to dismantle humoral theory by pointing out they didn't even understand what something as basic as blood really was. But we also have to really consider that the blood that humoralists were talking about, the thing they could literally point to and bleed out of the body, was not really the same thing that modern medicine calls blood. And this doesn't mean they were wrong. It means they were describing a different thing. After all, blood in humoralism has an assigned temperature, moisture, and element. It has a correlated psychological disposition. Its formation and movement are different. Its functions are different. Its basic makeup is different. None of this is present in the modern conceptualization of blood. So, one could argue that the blood of humoral medicine is not at all the blood of modern medicine. They were simply not describing the same phenomena. Said a different way, modern blood is a part of biology, obviously. Humoral blood is part of cosmology and correlation. Therefore, the comparison is really disingenuous. And this brings up interesting questions about how you define and label something. What are the underlying biases? Are we really looking at something on its own terms. And I remember getting into a disagreement with a translator about the Chinese medical name for the organ called the spleen. He said the Western and Chinese spleens were the same. I said they were different. They happen to have the same label, but they represent entirely different things, intersecting only in the agreement of the physical organ being talked about, but not their actual functions at all. So, as a translator, what do you have fidelity to? Technical jargon or semantic field? The problem I was trying to point out was prioritizing lexical equivalence over conceptual equivalence. And I think the same thing is happening with the humoral concept of blood. And of course, whether you agree or disagree is entirely up to you. Now, let's look at the other humors through the same lens. Obviously, from a modern point of view, humors aren't real. And that's fair. But real depends upon what your view of the humors is. Are they literal, tangible things? Or are they organizing principles in a grander theory? Or are they both? In a system like this, whether something is real or not depends as much on what you can do with it as whether you can see it. In other words, does a theory that rests upon humors get results? Does it effectively treat the patient? In this sense, you don't really prove anything with physiology. You only know if your theory works by looking at it and treating pathology. After all, pathology is physiology gone awry. So, if you can fix pathology, your theories of physiology must be at least kind of right. And I don't mean in the dismissive, a broken clock is right twice a day way. We can illustrate this with an example. Suppose you have excess yellow bile in the stomach. The symptoms are acid reflux, bitter taste, flushed face, irritability, a little feeling of heat or flushing, smelly loose bowels multiple times per day, and cramping and spasming of the stomach and abdomen. A Western diagnosis might be a kind of generic GERD or reflux. In any event, there is a loss of tone of the lower esophageal sphincter and elevated stomach acid. If there is an ulcer, then there's also erosion of the stomach lining. There will also likely be local inflammation and possibly also downstream problems such as dysbiosis, especially if there has been a lot of antacid or H2 blocker use. Constant pain from GERD will aggravate the vagus nerve and upregulate the sympathetic nervous system, making one irritable and edgy and causing facial flushing. As said, the standard modern treatment is antacids, H2 blockers, and proton pump inhibitors. Now, a humoral treatment can be found in a formula from the Ontodotarium Nicolai called Oxysaccharum. It reads as follows. Oxysaccharum is so called from oxy, which means vinegar, and zucchero, which means sugar. It is useful in acute tertian fevers and not truly in quartans. It purges yellow bile present in the stomach. Take 1 pound of sugar, 8 ounces of the juice of pomegranates, and 4 ounces of vinegar. Place them over the fire in a lined vessel and let it boil, constantly stirring with a spatula until it reaches the thickness of sugar, so that it can be carried in a small box. It is given in the morning with warm water in a dose of 1.5 ounces. So what is this formula doing? We know from the description that it's getting rid of yellow bile. It has pomegranate juice, vinegar, and sugar, a lot of sugar. And when we look at the structure of the formula, pomegranate is listed in Ibn Sina's Natural Pharmaceuticals as cold and moist. Energetically, cold and moist therapeutics are the antidote to hot and dry yellow bile. So, it purges the heat and dryness of the yellow bile. It's also described as sour. And in classical humoral medicine, herbs are not generally described by taste. the same way that they are in modern Western herbal medicine or Chinese herbal medicine. So it's important that it's mentioned here, and we'll get to that in a sec. Not only is pomegranate cold and moist, it's specifically listed as relieving muscle spasms in the digestive system and having somewhat of a laxative effect. So it relaxes, cools, and moistens to flush out yellow bile. It's aided in this by vinegar. Vinegar is also cold and moist and has a drying function. This seems a little contradictory. What this means is that vinegar is moist because it's a liquid, but it's also astringent. So it has a drying effect upon the body, particularly membranes and upon fluid substances. So it is seen as breaking the yellow bile apart to be flushed out. And this corresponds in modern terms to vinegar dissolving bile salts and promoting gastric emptying. Of course, bile salts are not yellow bile. Sugar can go a lot of different ways because there are a lot of different kinds of sugar. And by that I mean in unrefined sugars, we're not just talking about sucrose, fructose, or glucose combinations. We're also talking about plant byproducts. So the kind of sugar in different recipes makes a difference. But here, mostly what the sugar is for is to protect the mucosal membranes from too much dryness that is being caused by the heat of the yellow bile, and also to protect the mucosal membranes against the vinegar. So we have two cold ingredients, pomegranate and vinegar. And in energetic terms, we know cold means going from a state of more energy to less energy. So cold moves the tissue or the organ away from hyperfunction, excitability, inflammation, into a state of reduced function, calm, relaxation, reduction of inflammation. In terms of modern physiology, the humoral concept of cold would look like something that slows down the nervous system, is anti-inflammatory, antipyretic, and maybe also antibiotic if that infection comes with local heat and swelling, and not all infections do. Viewed through a Western lens, excess bile acids in the stomach irritate the nerves. They act on TRPV1 receptors, ASIC, the acid-sensing ion channels, and vagal nociceptive fibers, and cause sympathetic nervous system overactivation. They're really irritating. That's going to look like, in addition to pain, nausea, jitteriness, flushing, and agitation. So if pomegranate is described as cold and having an affinity for the stomach and intestines, and addressing yellow bile, which is a state of heat and excess, it's going to have to put the brakes on those things by downregulating, relaxing, and subjectively cooling things off. And it plausibly does this through several mechanisms. Punicalagins in pomegranate decrease vagal nociceptive firing. They reduce TRPV1 activation. They stabilize enteric sensory neurons, and they decrease nausea signaling. So in short, they work to reduce nerve irritation. The punicalagins and ellagic acid are also GABAergic, meaning they increase, mimic, or enhance GABA. GABA is, of course, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. They also reduce neuroinflammation. They also lower gastric inflammatory cytokines, thus treating inflammation and also reducing sympathetic activation. So this means downshifting a nervous system that has been revving up due to bile acid irritation. And all of these mechanisms are what is captured by the description of cold. Of course, ancient humoral physicians obviously didn't know how exactly pomegranate worked in modern terms. but they could chart with fine detail that it did, and the way in which it did. Now, back to the description of sour. Pomegranate is specifically described as sour in the Canon of Medicine, Volume 2, Natural Pharmaceuticals. Now, flavors were not descriptors or ways of explaining herbal energetics in humoralism. So we know that this is an important distinction for this herb and must be special in how it exerts its effect. And this makes sense. Sour flavors act on TRPV1 and TRPA1 receptors, and also modulate ASIC channels. The effect of this is muscle relaxation. Sour flavors relieve muscle cramping, and this muscle cramping is present in humoral terms in yellow bile in the stomach, manifesting as abdominal guarding and spasming. TRP receptor activation directly relieves this. Incidentally, this is also why grandma or grandpa or somebody might have kept pickle juice in the fridge or mustard by the bed to relieve muscle cramps at night. A lot of the time we default think that muscle aches are due to electrolyte imbalance. Often it's due to nerve imbalance, too much sympathetic tone. And this shows up at night because you stop moving, and in stillness, held muscle tension becomes very obvious and uncomfortable. Pickle juice, or mustard, because of the vinegar, activates the TRP receptors and causes relaxation. Now, would this formula work? I have no idea. I've never tried it. It looks interesting. How much pomegranate would you actually need for these pharmacological effects? I have no idea on that either. I haven't dug that far into it. Maybe it's totally possible with this formula. Maybe it takes gallons. Maybe that's why it's cooked down so much. But it's still interesting because it would seem the classic formula is capturing something. And honestly, it seems a lot more compelling than Rolaids and acid blockers. But the point is yellow bile a real thing? Are any of the humors real things? Maybe, maybe not. It depends upon what you define as real. Does real mean physical form you can point to? Or can something be real as function or theory? And if that theory enables you to come up with a novel and effective solution, well, that seems pretty useful and maybe also real. Now let's talk about second pepsis. Second pepsis is also governed by the natural or vegetative faculty, and this time it occurs in the liver itself. The chyle received from the intestines is again acted upon through the instrumental faculties of attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion, and turned into blood. Through attraction, the chyle is brought to the liver by way of the portal vein. There it is held by the faculty of retention. By way of the faculty of alteration, it is cooked, purified, and transformed, essentially concocted from chyle into blood. Blood in humoral medicine is the most complete and usable humor of the body. It provides nutrition to all parts of the body and carries the natural spirit. And again, I would argue that humoral blood is not the same as modern medicine's blood. In the process of the creation of blood, by heating, refining, and removing impurities, the other humors are created. The physical separation of impurities, which are actually humors, is based on the resultant humor's density. The lightest rises and the heaviest sinks. The other humors are a kind of impurity in relation to the refined blood, but they are a relative impurity that is still a necessary physiologic fluid. And so they're not an impurity in the sense of a pathology. After the concoction of blood, most of the blood is sent from the liver to nourish the organs and tissues, while a portion goes directly to the heart and is converted with Pneuma into the vital spirit. The other humors are then also sent to their respective domains of the body. So let's look at the humors themselves. We have yellow bile, blood, phlegm, and black bile. The yellow bile is the lightest. It is the foam or scum that rises to the top. And if you've made broth or jam or cooked heavy stews, you know there's a foamy scum that floats to the surface that you skim off. And if you've ever decocted herbs, or if you've just made a cup of peppermint tea, you know the aromatics, the volatile oils, are floating on the surface. They hit your nose and your eyes, and you get a really strong organoleptic sensation even before you taste it. This volatile quality is the quality of yellow bile, the ability to warm, pierce, and mobilize. And being volatile, it is at the very top. Yellow bile helps to provide the heat of transformation to the stomach by making sure the stomach tissue is nice and warm, and it is thought to have a cleansing effect by driving impurities out of the body. From the liver, the majority is transported directly to the gallbladder, with only a tiny bit carried as an adjunct in the blood. The next level down is the blood. Blood is the most prevalent humor and the most important, with many vital functions. These are nourishment. Blood is the nutritive substance that feeds the organs. Growth and repair. Blood is used as a direct physical substrate. Blood carries the calor innatus, the innate heat or spark of life, through the body. Blood moistens the body. And the moistening here pertains specifically to the moisture internal to the organs and tissues. So it governs softness, flexibility, and suppleness. Phlegm also carries moisture, but the moisture of phlegm, by contrast, governs surfaces, cavities, membranes. So blood is organ moisture, phlegm is mucous membrane and joint and capsule moisture. Blood is also in charge of reproductive substances because reproductive substances are created from the blood. So this is obviously menstrual blood, but this is also mother's milk, which is transformed menstrual blood, and it's also semen, which is considered excess blood that is not lost in menses, therefore subsequently refined. Blood is the substrate for the spirits. The liver blood already contains the natural spirit. The heart kindles the vital spirit from that blood. The brain then refines the animal spirit from that vital spirit. So the clarity and strength of all three spirits, spiritus or nomata, ultimately depend upon blood's quality. Blood also shows up in color and complexion, and as mentioned, blood carries the other humors to the organs and their respective repositories. Blood in the veins and arteries is again a kind of admixture. All of the other humors flow with the blood, which means that when the blood reaches a particular organ, the organ can siphon off the respective humor, because again, humors are not in solution. They're not dissolved in the blood. They coexist in a mixed state. In fact, humors dissolved in the blood is actually a kind of pathology. And just as blood carries humors to an organ or a tissue, it carries waste away to be excreted. The next dense is phlegm, which is just below the blood. Phlegm is a thick and cold substance. Now, the phlegm of humoral phlegm is not the phlegm we think of when we get a cold. It's just like with blood. Same name, different concept. What we call phlegm now is pathologic. Thick and excess secretions from the mucous membranes. Now, of course, I just said that phlegm is a thick substance, but it's not pathologically thick, like getting a cold. Humoral phlegm is on the thinner side, and it has a very important physiologic function. Being a little bit thinner, it moistens and spreads out. This is essential for the health of mucous membranes, as well as the synovial fluid of the joints. It is also linked to the serous fluid in body cavities and proper brain and nerve function, because the brain in humoral medicine needs to be cold. It's not healthy to be hot-headed. And think about it, whenever you have a fever, you're not thinking clearly. And with a high enough fever, there is loss of consciousness. Phlegm is the least concocted or changed of all of the humors. It is also generally seen to be the coldest humor, and you might wonder why. After all, phlegm is cold and wet, and when you hear about black bile, it's going to be described as cold and dry. Ice is colder than cold water. So, what makes phlegm, a liquid, colder than black bile, a solid? The reason is, when something is wet, there is energy transfer. Moisture shunts or transmits heat away. If it's 45 degrees out, you can get away with walking around in a t-shirt or a light sweatshirt. You see it all the time in the Midwest. But if your clothes are wet, you're freezing. That's why search and rescue has the saying, wet in 50 is more dangerous than dry in 30. The other thing that makes phlegm colder is that it moves. It's not frozen in a static state. So it's not localized like black bile is, but rather it spreads its coldness to other areas. And this means it takes heat away from other areas, whereas black bile stays put. The location of phlegm is, like blood, throughout the body. And phlegm does flow more with the blood than the other humors do. But phlegm does also have some locations it resides in, namely the joints, the lungs, the surfaces, the mucosal membranes, and the brain. Lastly, we have the heaviest humor, black bile, and this sinks to the bottom of the fluid matrix. Black bile, while still a humor and technically a fluid, acts very much like a solid. Black bile is carried in the veins with the blood to the spleen, specifically the splenic vein, where it is siphoned off and stored. It is linked to the material form of the body, particularly the harder structures like the bones, ligaments, and cartilage. Energetically, it has the effect of congealing and binding. Blood clots are probably central to this, which is why pathologies like masses are seen to be disorders of black bile. It is also essential for binding waste together for excretion, and this relates to bowel function. It firms the bowels so that they may pass. It also relates to holding the blood in the veins. We see pathologies of deficient black bile in easy bruising, menstrual spotting when it's not due to heat. And insofar as black bile is housed in the spleen and one of its functions is to hold the blood in the veins, this means that humoral spleen shares an interesting function with the Chinese spleen. Both govern the body's ability to hold blood in the vessels. But aside from that similarity, the organs are functionally entirely different. So why is black bile held by the spleen? Why not some other organ? In modern medicine, we know that, in addition to immune function, the spleen filters the blood and is a reservoir of blood. And this has bearing on dissections of the classical period. Because when an animal dies, is butchered, or is killed for the sake of dissections, blood flow stops and the blood pools. This, among other things, causes coagulation. And mass coagulation of blood occurs from 10 to 30 minutes after death. So, this means by the time a classical anatomist would have gotten to the spleen, what they would have found was not a living spleen filled with red blood, but a dead spleen filled with a large quantity of coagulated blood, which would have had a black, tarry appearance. And given the nature of blood to coagulate and the large amount of blood in the spleen, it's not hard to see how black bile would be seen to be housed there. It's also not hard to imagine that someone might look at blood's ability to coagulate seen in real time and see that as a kind of vital function that is so important that it can't be particular to the blood itself, but happening as a process throughout the body. We also have to recognize that people in the classical age didn't really know what the spleen was. And this wasn't just Greek humoral medicine. This was Ayurvedic and classical Chinese medicine as well. Ancient theorists from all medical systems plugged the spleen into existing theories in whatever way made most cohesive sense. Essentially, they identified meaningful correlative symptoms. In other words, certain symptoms always seem to cluster together, and they put these symptoms into correlative and causative categories, then assigned them to organ systems. Of course, this assignment wasn't arbitrary. There was some evidence to suggest the actual organ was involved. But it did mean that sometimes with organs like the spleen, things are a little abstract. This is why you can have an herbal system like Chinese herbalism that has very effective treatments for digestive complaints, even though it assigns in its classical theory a non-digestive organ, the spleen, a digestive function. And again, if you're not doing surgery and your main modality for treating internal medicine complaints is herbalism, anatomical accuracy is not really important. What's important is robust theory with internally consistent logic, which allows one to organize individual symptoms into larger symptom patterns, which have clear treatment strategies and herbal formulas, which then have reproducible positive results as defined by the metrics of the system itself and not some unrelated system imposed on it. And this is also why you can have an herbal system like Greek humoralism, which treats the spleen in an entirely different way, and yet is still valid, because it organizes individual symptoms into larger symptom patterns, which also have clear treatment strategies and herbal formulas, which have reproducible positive effects as defined by the metrics of the system itself. But getting back to the ancient Greeks, they actually did know that the spleen filtered the blood in some way. Even Sina, who was not Greek but inherited Greek humoralism and was a major figure in the Islamic Golden Age around 1000 CE, said explicitly that the spleen contained the residue of broken up blood. And the only way for broken up blood to get to the spleen is if the spleen is filtering it out. He further said the spleen removes black bile from the blood both for its own nourishment, but also to prevent the blood from being damaged. So again, filtering, removing damaged blood. So to sum up, we now have all of the humors created in second Pepsis. Blood is concocted in the liver from chyle. In the decoction process, the volatile portion, which is the yellow bile, ascends to be stored in the gallbladder. The black bile is carried to the spleen via the splenic vein, and what is meant to circulate widely in the body is the blood and the phlegm. And the blood and phlegm flow together but do not mix. There are trace amounts of yellow bile and black bile, but they should not be present and flowing admixed with the blood in any appreciable quantity. All of these humors provide all of the organs the motive force and ability to complete their various functions by determining their tissue states. And those various functions enabled by the powers of the humors is determined by the specific organs themselves. This is all governed by the natural faculty, otherwise known as the vegetative faculty. Now, let's compare second Pepsis with modern medicine. We already talked about the blood being different. The gallbladder stores bile, but not yellow bile. And the function of bile in the gallbladder, emulsifying fats, is different than yellow bile, which is an acrid heating substance. About the humors themselves. Again, modern medicine says there are no physical humors, because there aren't. And again, does that mean they aren't real and useful as part of guiding theory? That really depends upon what one's modalities are and whether one is more comfortable with the abstract or the literal. I think their justification for bloodletting is pretty hard to get behind, but I've also never seen it done. But I definitely do think they have value as a descriptor within a classical pharmacological model. But also, we shouldn't be so black and white. We should be more flexible in our thinking and use both. Both capture some aspect of reality. But that's just my soapbox. And of course, there is quite a bit more we could dissect and parse out about things that aren't quite right, but those are the broad strokes, and we'll be here all day if we keep going. Now let's talk about third Pepsis. Third Pepsis occurs at the level of the organs and tissues. Blood, perfused outward from the liver through the veins to its final destination in the organs, undergoes a final assimilation process. And this happens at the site of the parenchyma, the soft functional part of the organ, the fibrous connective tissue, and the membranes. In this process, the blood is consumed as nutrition for the organ, or assimilated and made into the structure of the organ. At the same time, waste products are removed. And now is a good time to briefly mention that blood flow in the humoral system was not a closed circuit and did not view the heart as a pump, at least not for blood. So movement of blood extended outward through the veins via the propulsive force of the liver in a tidal fashion. We'll come back to this. But lack of a closed circulatory system also means that in order for waste to be removed, the waste would not travel through the veins, but through the lower pressure capillary system to its organs of excretion. The kidneys and urinary tract were responsible for removing excess water. Defecation removed solid stool, but also removed morbid humors, and was the specific exit route of yellow and black bile. The lungs removed the vapors and fumes arising from the conversion of blood into vital spirit in the heart. We'll get to that. The skin, by way of sweating, removed phlegm from the periphery, and pus could be the expulsion of phlegm or yellow bile too. Mucus is, of course, the excretion of phlegm, and vomit is the excretion of yellow bile or thickened phlegm. Lastly, there was the final pathway of insensible perspiration, which was the continuous and unnoticeable removal of invisible vapors and minute excrement. This was actually considered to be the most important excretory pathway, accounting for the removal of the majority of the body's waste. Now, it might seem strange to say the most important excretory pathway is something unseen, unnoticed, unobservable, and therefore unprovable. But this allowed for the explanation of disease when there was no obvious cause. The thinking was, the expulsion of some humor must be blocked. This also recognized that the surface of the body needed to breathe, and the expulsion of waste via insensible perspiration happened through the pores of the skin. And as an aside, there is a very similar concept in Chinese medicine. The single greatest cause of disease in Chinese medicine is wind. In fact, wind is called the chief of the 100 diseases. Now, what is this thing called wind? Wind is something that can enter the body by way of the pores. If the regulation of the pores is weak, wind can lodge in the skin, creating stiffness and spasming. This is falling asleep under a draft and waking up and not being able to turn your head. This can lead to impaired movement of fluids at the surface of the body, resulting in swelling of the skin. This can then lead to skin conditions like itching, eczema, and some presentations of psoriasis. In fact, there is a close connection between the skin and the joints. So, wind lodging in the skin is linked to arthritic conditions over time. And of course, we're not talking about wind as a thing. It's not the movement of a gas. It's a metaphor for pathologic process. And there are certainly neurologic aspects of this. A weakness of the closing function of the surface of the body, with a dislike of wind and drafts, with clamminess and cold sweat, is correlated to anxiety and correlated to palpitations and muscle tremoring. This would be a kind of dysregulated autonomic nervous function. And the herbs used to address these conditions of clamminess, sweating, palpitations, and anxiety are those ones that do regulate autonomic nervous function. And those herbs used to treat these conditions of dislike of winds and drafts, cold sweat, clamminess, anxiety, palpitations are herbs that regulate the autonomic nervous system, in particular the sympathetic nervous system. Moving on in our talking about the regulation of the surface of the body, digestive health is also linked to the skin. Dry, scaly skin or oozing skin can indicate the health of the intestines. And if a person has dry, flaky skin, they are less likely to be able to sweat. They don't have the necessary body fluids. And so they are more likely to also have dry, hard constipation. If the skin is oily and oozing with too much fluid on the surface, they are more likely to have digestive inflammation and looser bowel movements. And importantly, the successful herbal treatment of many, or if not all, of these conditions would depend upon regulating the pores and sweating, or stopping sweating in some way. This is seen to be vitally important, so much so in fact that the foundational text of herbal treatment and theory in Chinese medicine was very heavily weighted to treating diseases that affected the surface of the body, and these treatments regulated sweating in some way. So the surface of the body is linked to many, many body systems, and it is quite profound that both Chinese medicine and Greek humoral medicine caught this. Third Pepsis is quite important and complex. All of the natural faculties of attraction, retention, alteration, and expulsion happen on a micro organ and tissue level also. But we have to remember that Greek humoral medicine was teleologic, meaning that form exists for the sake of completing design or potential. It was not the view that function was the consequence of form, but rather that form arose to serve and enable function. In the grander scope of things, this meant third Pepsis was the fulfillment of an ultimate potential, as expressed by design. It is a kind of actualization. Therefore, it's where the rubber hits the road, where one is moving into direct expression in material form. If the humors are real, but you can't really see them, which means they are really only kind of real, the body organs and tissues are undeniable. So, third Pepsis is in some ways the most important part of the whole process because it is the proof the teleologic worldview rests upon. It is the point where theory becomes reality and where gross substrate is somehow converted into material form. It is where abstract elemental qualities become fixed in substance. So you can kind of say it closes the loop of theory. Even so, while it's philosophically important, it really wasn't clinically important at all. Third pepsis is a macro process across all tissues, so there aren't really treatment strategies to address it. The organs, tissues, and humors are already created at that point, so there's nothing you can really do. If there's a problem, you have to back up a step and look at the quality of the substrate, the humors, as the only thing you can really change, because it is what has not been made static in material yet. So that is third pepsis in terms of Galenic humoral medicine of the 1st and 2nd century CE. But a quick note, in later periods, particularly the Middle Ages, third pepsis was reconceptualized for teaching purposes by conflating pepsis with the refinement of pneuma or spirits. So the heart and the brain became the location of third pepsis, which described how the spirits were refined, and the generation of tissues was then fourth pepsis. This, as far as I can tell, was purely for didactic purposes and not the original theory. So for now, we'll stick with keeping pepsis and refinement of the spirits separate. So we've gotten through pepsis, the materiality of the body. But the body is more than a lump of flesh. The body is also a process, and this process needs direction and macro organization. And this happens via the spirits. What are the spirits? First, a quick note on terminology. We're using the term spirits here, but let's define what that really means. In Latin, this is spiritus, and in Greek, it is pneuma. Both spiritus and pneuma in everyday ancient Latin and Greek meant wind, breath, or air. Consider in spiritus, inspiration, ex spiritus, expiration, a spiritus, aspiration, etc. In Latin, it took on the dimension of vitality or bearing, as in to be spirited or dispirited. It also meant influence, as in the ability of one thing to influence something else. For example, the transference of mood or quality, in which moods or environmental conditions were seen to be a resonance that could transfer from one person or environment to another. And this, to make a cross-cultural comparison, is actually very similar to the classical definition of qi in Chinese culture. Long before qi was conceptualized in the West as energy or the force, thanks to James Legge, Georges Soulier de Meuron, and later George Lucas, qi meant air, gas, mood, influence, bearing, etc. So, very, very similar. Spiritus and pneuma do not mean spirits as in ghosts or souls. Rather, they were seen to be subtle vapors, still material, but a very subtle matter. Put simply, they are subtle material substances that mediate between the physical body and the non-physical soul. But we have to be careful here when we talk about a non-physical soul, because Greek humoral medicine is materialistic. It does not rely on the concept of a non-physical soul to explain phenomena like thought, consciousness, or volitional motion. So, the non-physical soul is not part of diagnosis and treatment and isn't central to theory, at least Greek humoral medicine. That would change when it went to the Muslim world. Nonetheless, the material theory was not seen to be enough to explain the entirety of the human experience. So, it was postulated there must be some kind of non-physical driver to this material process. Now, whether this non-physical soul was immortal or not was not a primary concern. And Galen himself said he really didn't have an opinion because he didn't have any proof either way. Choosing to not define the non-physical soul allowed humoral medicine to be plugged nicely into the very religiously conservative Islamic and Christian cultures of the Middle Ages as humoralism spread first to the Middle East and then Europe, because as much as humoralism said it didn't know what the non-physical soul was, and whether it was immortal or not, and didn't really care too much about it, Islam and Christianity said they knew exactly what it was, and where it came from, and they cared a lot about it. So the non-physical soul being undefined was one key factor that allowed the adoption of humoralism fairly wholesale into these cultures. Teleology could easily be replaced by divinity with no conflict. Now getting back to the spirits, remember in the previous video on teleologic theory, there were 3 spirits adapted into medicine from Plato's tripartite soul, which were reason, emotion, and biologic drive. These were the animal, vital, and natural spirit, and they each have their own location. The natural spirit is housed in the liver, the vital spirit is housed in the heart, and the animal spirit is housed in the brain. These spirits govern macro functions of the body. They coordinate, build, and refine, and they exist in bidirectional hierarchy. The natural spirit creates the substrate for the vital spirit, which creates the substrate for the animal spirit. And the animal spirit governs cognitive function and the sensorium. The vital spirit governs a little less, being the emotions, and the natural spirit governs the least, being unconscious vegetative function. Together, they govern sensation, perception, interpretation, integration, and action. In other words, nervous system function. So, this is coordinated unconscious processes, sensorium, volitional movement, cognition, and the degrees of hierarchy between them. Roughly speaking, the vegetative spirit, housed in the liver, maps to the enteric nervous system and the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. The vital spirit, housed in the heart, maps to the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. And the animal spirit of the brain maps to everything in the brain, including but not limited to the cerebral cortex, limbic system, motor cortex, and somatic nervous system, sensory nerves, parietal, occipital lobes, etc. To sum up, these are the higher level organization of not how the body is doing something, but what the body is doing. And we touched upon these earlier. These spirits are linked to the macro faculties. These spirits are the motive force of the macro faculties. They are what enable the faculties to work. In this way, they are the power or spark that fuels a gross material process in a subtle material substance. So, the faculties and the spirits are very closely linked. You can't have one without the other. That's why it's not uncommon later in the Middle Ages that the terms faculty and spirit are conflated, and this can be a little confusing. So why did they place the spirits where they did? It's really just intuitive. It's what you feel and what makes sense. The natural spirit controls the guts, so it's in the guts. The vital spirit is in the heart because that's where you feel emotions as a neurochemical event. You certainly don't feel emotions in the brain. And while you feel certain emotions in different parts of the body, you'll also feel them in the heart at the same time. So all emotions ultimately go back to the heart. Language encodes the somatic quality of the emotional body precisely, and also poetically and somewhat unconsciously. And this is really interesting. For example, take such expressions as butterflies in the stomach, a gut feeling, a heavy heart, one's blood is boiling, one's blood runs cold. You know immediately what that feels like. You know precisely where it is, the physical sensation, the emotional quality, and the thought patterns that correlate with it. And of course, it's not just English. In German, we have Schmetterlinge im Bauch, which is also butterflies in the stomach. There is etwas liegt schwer im Magen, something lies heavy on the stomach. Das Herz rutscht mir in die Hose. My heart slips into my trousers, which means sudden fear or shock. And this also points to voiding of the bowels as a result of fear. otherwise known as scared shitless. There's also die Galle kommt mir hoch. The gall rises up, means you get pissed off. And this relates to the Old English expression, you don't have the gall, meaning you don't have the guts. Gall, of course, relating to bile, relating to the gallbladder and liver. In Japanese, there is mune ga dokidoki suru. The chest or heart goes dokidoki, which means you're nervous, so nervous palpitations. There is mune ga ippai ni naru. The chest becomes full from being overwhelmed or moved. There is kimu ga hieru. The liver goes cold, meaning to be terrified. And this means you're either cowardly or scared. You don't have the gall. So you see liver being cold, the gallbladder being cold, as opposed to having gall, meaning your gallbladder is getting hot. And of course, there is kimuga suaru, the liver is firmly seated, which is to have strong nerves, to be kind of unmovable. And this means courageous, and this is similar to, in a way, to die Galle kommt mir hoch, the gall rises up, you're pissing me off. We see the same expressions in Chinese, and my Chinese pronunciation is terrible, but here it goes. Dan xiao means small gallbladder. You're timid or cowardly. And we have dan da, big gallbladder, bold and daring. So anyway, that's an aside, but that points to something that language encodes this kind of somatic experience. And this somatic experience is somatic. It's felt in the body. Every language in the world does this. In modern medicine, this points directly to the activation of different aspects of the nervous system and vascular tone, which will be felt in different areas of the body, and also to the release of catecholamines like norepinephrine and epinephrine, which will be felt in the chest. And lastly, in regards to the brain as the seat of the animal spirit, that's pretty obvious and a no-brainer. So that being said, let's talk about how refinement of the spirits happens. The natural spirit, in charge of all of the vegetative functions, is housed in the liver and the venous system, i.e. the blood. It is produced in the process of blood formation as crude chyle is refined into blood in the liver by way of the liver's innate heat. And in that process, a subtle vapor is created within the blood itself. This subtle vapor is the natural spirit. It is the finest smoke that arises in the concoction process. This being the case, the quality of the natural spirit is directly dependent upon the quality of the chyle produced in first Pepsis. This chyle is going to depend upon, in turn, the quality and balance of the humors acting through the stomach and intestines in the digestive process. So, if the substrate of chyle is overly cooked and thick, acrid and biting, or undercooked and thin and watery and not substantive, or if there's a lot of blood that directly impacts the digestion process, this will impact not only the quality of the blood and the humors produced, but it will impact the subtle natural spirit itself. Bad substrate yields bad finished product. And if your finished product of one stage is the substrate of the next, you're going to have problems throughout the whole process. The vital spirit is created when blood, which is described as moving from the liver to the heart via the vena cava and then carried to the right ventricle, passes through pores in the heart wall between the left and right ventricle. And once there, this blood, carrying the spiritus naturalis, the natural spirit, mixes with the inhaled air, the spiritus from the outside. The inhaled spiritus stokes the fire of the heart and is then refined into the spiritus vitalis, the vital spirit. The right ventricle, then, is the location of the refinement of the natural spirit into the vital spirit. Not all blood in the heart was seen as being converted into spiritus vitalis. Some nourished the lungs directly, but the majority was low quality and would be vaporized in the heating process in the heart. And the sooty vapors that would result from that are what would be exhaled by the lungs. And now that we've talked about the liver and the heart, we can pause and talk about circulation. Greek humoral medicine did not posit a closed circulatory system. Blood was seen to extend from the liver in waves, not unlike a lake or sea. It's not surprising then that just as the ebb and flow of the tide of a lake or sea is determined by the moon was also seen as the justification for the ebb and flow of blood, particularly the menstrual cycle. The influence of the month on the blood in tidal fashion wasn't a daily event, but a monthly. In fact, menses in Latin means both menstrual cycle and month. Closely related is the Old Greek mene, meaning moon, and these originate from the Proto-Indo-European word mens. Again, I'm not pronouncing that right, which also meant both moon and month. So, as the blood extended distally into the organs, then tissues, then onward to more superficial aspects of the body, it wasn't a closed system, so it was simply consumed, or it was converted into new tissue. This meant blood was in a constant state of new generation, because it was constantly being consumed. It had to be generated over and over and over again. It was not recycled. But even though humoral medicine didn't posit a closed system, ancient physicians still knew there was a difference between arteries and veins. The veins they assigned to the liver, and through the veins flowed the nutritive blood and the natural spirit. The arteries were assigned to the heart, and through the arteries flowed what was called the airy blood, which was the hot blood, which carried the vital spirit throughout the body. Airy blood was not airy from external spiritus inhaled, so they didn't conceive of a kind of oxygenated blood. Rather, airy blood was airy from the spiritus vitalis of the heart. So now is a good point to check in with modern medicine and see the differences. What did the humoralists get right? What did they get wrong? And what impact did that have upon their actual treatments? Firstly, of course, modern medicine refutes the three-spirit theory. While we drew corollaries earlier to nerve function, we have to admit this is reductive and conflating. It would be more accurate to say that they were observing and grouping clusters of observed physiologic patterns into relational categories that made the most sense. So they grouped the elements of organs and organ functions with what we might call nerve function, and then with psychology and temperament, with observable effects of diet and lifestyle, with environmental factors, with seasonal factors, with an overlay of herbal theory, held together in a philosophical framework that reflected the cultural understanding of the human place in the macrocosm, the human as microcosmic reflection of the macrocosm, individual autonomy versus societal obligation and responsibility, etc., all as a kind of macro patterning. So of course, this is going to be metaphoric and abstract. But certainly in the field of medicine, the question of does something work is more important than how it works. And whether a theory is true or not depends upon reproducible results. That being the case, everyone will have to decide for themselves whether the theory is true or not. And hopefully, one would do that after one actually has enough information to go on, i.e., seen it in practice enough times to know. So, that is to say, enough of theory, let's focus on anatomy. Obviously, the circulatory system wasn't modeled correctly. In humoralism, the heart was thought to be a pump, but the closed circulatory system observed by William Harvey was 1700 years away from being recognized. So the expanding, contracting action of the heart in humoralism was seen to draw in pneuma or spiritus from the outside into the lungs to pass to the heart to combine with the natural spirit and the blood to create the vital spirit, and then to push that vital spirit outward. And as humoral medicine did not conceive of a closed circulatory system, blood was seen to be in an open system, spread from the liver by the veins, moving in a kind of tidal fashion to the organs where it would be consumed. There was no concept of oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood that would be recycled. Importantly, we also know that there are no pores between the right and left ventricle that would support the theory of blood movement from the liver to the heart between the two ventricles for the creation of the vital spirit. These pores were observed in animal dissections and applied to humans. Now the question then is, how did this impact treatment? As we talked about in a previous video, the Greek cultural bias was that ill health was caused by plethora, meaning too much of something, and this something gets in the way. And if something in the way can't be cleared out, it rots and creates putrefaction. So the Greeks definitely had a fear of excess more than they feared lack of vitality. And we have inherited this. The alternative health industry is obsessed with detoxification, purgation, fasting, intense sweats in a sauna, cleanses, and is very afraid of toxic overload, parasites, candida, etc. And in modern times, one can't help but see a kind of moral dimension to this fear of excess. There's a sense of there is something wrong with us that we need to get rid of. Maybe an unconscious original sin kind of impression. Plus a self-judgment of personal indulgence and fear of a lack of character, and then you mix that with a fear of foreign entities that might invade, and you get a perfect storm of unsolvable health obsession. And I'm not saying that those concerns aren't valid. If you have worms, you better get rid of them, if you have the ability. But there is a mental preoccupation with purity that isn't healthy or real, but rather ideological. And a lot of people do have worms and don't even know it, and have no noticeable consequence. And this mental preoccupation or ideology is something that happens in ancient humoral medicine in their fear of plethora. Because in their model, blood, and so this is tying back into the heart and their open view of circulation, blood is continually being produced and not recycled. And thus, it could be a major cause of disease in that it creates stagnation and putrefaction. And now, if that's a major cause of disease, you have a rationale for bloodletting. And we all know the stereotypes of the quack medieval doctor who killed his patient by draining their blood. So we know how much it was overused. George Washington was killed by bloodletting. That being said, we have to look at the time periods it was being overused. It saw its zenith during the period known as heroic medicine, and that was from 1750 to 1850, which was also a time of significant decline in humoral medicine understanding. It's a weird time because humoral medicine was being called into question with new anatomical observations, so it was greatly challenged, and faith in it was declining. But there wasn't an alternative yet, so they still did it and really doubled down on it. And at the same time, sophisticated herbal medicine was out of fashion because of the new field of chemistry, which questioned its very theoretic underpinnings. So what did they do? They just started bleeding everybody. But prior to that rather dumbed down humoral medicine, it also has to be pointed out that Galen and even Sina were very clear when bloodletting should be used and when it shouldn't. And they said it definitely shouldn't be used for weaker people. The prohibitions were, don't do it in weak and frail patients. Don't do it in cold and dry patients. Don't do it in the elderly. Don't do it to someone with a feeble pulse. The purpose was to balance the patient, But again, 1800 years later, that's not what heroic medicine did. Heroic medicine's purpose was to shock the patient into health by creating a life or death crisis. That being said, I still really can't think of a good justification for bloodletting at all. It doesn't make sense to me. I think it was really a failing of theory. But I have to be honest, I've never done it. I have never seen it done, so maybe I don't know enough to have an informed opinion. The other thing that we could say about the fear of plethora is that there has been the argument that this led to the use of a lot of purgative and emetic formulas in medieval medicine. Essentially, the thinking is if something is wrong, you puke it out or you crap it out. But I'm not convinced. Maybe that's true of a particular time period. I could see that being a Middle Ages thing, or maybe it's true of a certain level of education of the doctor. But I've looked at a lot of formulas and I just don't see that as being over the top represented. I think we also need to contextualize this. This medicine existed in a time period when disease acted quickly. Infections, malnutrition, and exposure to the elements upped your odds of dying quickly from a simple illness going from 0 to 100 in 2 days. So you didn't have the luxury of wait and see and be gentle, because by the time you wait and see and be gentle, the disease process is beyond what you can treat. So that means you better get your shit together and make some bold moves. And if it's not blood-borne illness like plague, because that's its own problem, the pathologies that are most likely to kill you the quickest are bowel-related. If you get simultaneous chills and fever on day 1, which you think is a normal cold, and on day 3 you have high fever, profuse sweat, rapid pulse, irritability bordering on delirium, and dry and hard constipation, if you don't flush the bowels, your next step is loss of consciousness and death. That really doesn't happen in modern times, so we don't relate to that kind of danger. The most likely thing to kill you acutely is some kind of pneumonia, but that's a couple of weeks or months away, so you have time. The bottom line is, understanding context is really important in order to really be able to judge accurately. But getting back to anatomy and how inaccurate models of anatomy might lead to poor therapeutic results or dangerous outcomes, that's also not necessarily a given. And here it's interesting to note that Chinese medicine also did not consider the heart to be a pump, and thus also did not have the modern model of circulation. And yet, Chinese herbal formulas can be very, very effective for conditions in which the heart as pump isn't working right. This very much includes palpitation and arrhythmia. It is well recognized that certain herbs and the formulas that are built with these herbs do affect cardiac rate and rhythm, and the corollary symptomology of palpitations and arrhythmia. In particular, it clearly defines patterns of palpitations with anxiety, palpitations with panic attack, palpitations with feeling of cold and body tremoring, and many more, palpitations with irritability and heartburn. And what's important to note is that these symptoms are often well treated. In fact, palpitations with anxiety is one of the more straightforward and easier presentations to treat with Chinese herbology, assuming the practitioner knows what they're doing. And this is all in spite of the fact that the medical theory does not treat the heart as a pump and does not view the circulatory system as a closed system. Okay, so we have talked about the vital spirit, and now we have to talk about the animal spirit and the conversion of the, or I should say the refinement of the vital spirit to the animal spirit in the brain. This happens when the hot vital spirit travels from the heart via the carotid arteries up to the base of the brain. The ancient humoralists described a complex web of arteries called the rete mirabile that was a filter that would refine the vital spirit as it entered the skull. Except it didn't, because humans don't have a rete mirabile. Again, this was observed in animal dissections, namely ungulates like sheep, goats, and cattle, and was then applied erroneously to people. At any rate, the vital spirit then passed into what were conceived to be ventricles of the brain, where refinement took place. This refinement was different than the heating processes that happened before. The animal spirit governs thought, and proper thought has to be dispassionate. Therefore, it must be cool. So we see different temperatures at different stages of the process of the creation of vital substances. Digestion, or Pepsis, is a hot process. This heat reduces as substrate reaches the liver and the humors are produced. This echoes in the natural spirit and vital spirit, reducing in temperature when the animal spirit is formed. So the brain is cold and wet and acts more or less like a condenser. It cools the hot, volatile, vital spirit, thereby stabilizing it and giving it coherence to become the highly organized animal spirit. This transformation from a volatile, hot force, the vital spirit, to one that is stable, rational, and fluid, the animal spirit, was the core of cerebral refinement. There were three ventricles that were conceived: the anterior, middle, and posterior. The vital spirit was refined into animal spirit as it moved first from the anterior ventricle to the middle, and finally the posterior ventricle. When looking at the brain, difficulties with dissection of such a fine organism aside, the ancient anatomists were led away from viewing the gray matter as what was the most important part, and to viewing the cavities of the brain as the most essential. And this was because of how they conceived of Spiritus. The spirits, or Pneuma, were subtle matter, a fine gaseous form. Therefore, the most rarefied of them would have to move through and be housed in cavities. So, the cavities of the brain were what were seen to be the most important part of the brain, not the actual structures. And so, the humoral brain is quite a bit different than the modern brain. And looking at their descriptions, the anterior ventricle likely corresponds in location to what today is defined as the lateral ventricles. The middle ventricle likely corresponds in location to the modern third ventricle, and the posterior ventricle likely corresponds in location to the fourth ventricle, brainstem, and cerebellum. The anterior ventricle was the first to receive and start to refine the Spiritus Vitalis. It was the seat of the sensus communis, or common sense, and the faculty of imagination or fantasy. It took raw sensory input, sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, etc., and created a unified, coherent image. And therefore, a disorder of the humors in this chamber would lead to problems with perception and hallucinations, as the mind's ability to create that stable image was disrupted. The middle ventricle received the spiritus from the anterior ventricle and refined it further. It stabilized it to be able to perform the rational functions of cogitation, or thought, estimation, and judgment. This is where raw perception was analyzed, compared, and given meaning. Humoral imbalances here, especially from thick, cold phlegm or burnt black bile, were thought to impair reason and judgment, leading to confusion, illogical thought, and certain types of insanity. The posterior ventricle was where memory was stored. Impairment here was typically caused by cold and dry humors, like black bile, which could thicken the spirit and impede its ability to form or retrieve impressions. This led to amnesia or severe forgetfulness. So we can see that the brain, whose temperament was cold and wet, was most affected by too much wetness in the form of phlegm impairing movement, which led to dulled sensorium, sluggishness of mind, delirium, narcolepsy, developmental disorders, or even cloudy headedness, especially after eating. It was also affected by too much hot dryness in the form of yellow bile and burnt black bile, creating a kind of irritability, mania, or psychosis. And of course, the quality of the animal spirit was directly dependent upon the vital spirit. Poor vital spirit leads to weak animal spirit. And the vital spirit is dependent upon the natural spirit, and the natural spirit is dependent upon the blood, and the blood is dependent upon the chyle. So there is a long chain with multiple points of potential failure. So now that the animal spirit is created, it has to move through the body, and it does this by way of the nerves. And here, modern and humoral medicine kind of agree. The brain output happens by way of the nerves. But humoral doctors, of course, could not conceive of any electrochemical system of neurology, and people wouldn't know anything about neurotransmitters for another 1900 years. So, the humoralist's explanation was that the nerves were hollow, and the animal spirit traveled through them. And movement was created by the animal spirit in the nerves by causing swelling, tensing, and movement of the muscles, kind of in a quasi-hydraulic fashion. And just as specific brain functions were ascribed to specific ventricles, effects of humors on temperaments were described as well. There are three different types of poor quality animal spirit as a result of either something wrong with the location of refinement, which would be the brain itself, or the substrate that reaches the brain. And this became an early psychological model where humors are linked to certain personality traits. For example, if blood is dominant, then the person inevitably is balanced and therefore optimistic, social, and cheerful. If yellow bile is dominant, then there's too much heat, and this leads to a type of person that is quick-witted, but also prone to irritability, and maybe even prone to a little bit of manic behavior. If there is phlegm that's dominant, then there's too much cold and moisture in the system. So this leads to the type of person who is on the slower side, mentally and physically, but not necessarily stupid. Slowness of thought can be depth of thought as well. But they're going to be prone to having poor memory and just being more or less lethargic. If there is too much black bile, then there is too much cold dryness, and this coldness, again, creates more of a deeper philosophical introspective personality, but now not as fluid, not as flowing, not as flexible, so more prone to fear and paranoia. So, what is the difference here between modern and humoral medicine in terms of higher order thinking, brain construction, and function? As already stated, there is no rete mirabile. Also, the humoralists clearly thought the empty cavities of the brain were more important than the tissue of the brain, and that's obviously not correct. They conceived of the nerves as hollow tubes and had no conceptualization of electrochemical signals. Also, they claimed that there was a non-physical soul that was the ultimate driver of life process, even if they couldn't define it. Modern medicine, on the other hand, claims all mental processes are explainable by emergent properties of the physical, electrical, and chemical activity of the cerebral cortex, and therefore there is no need for or justification for an immaterial soul. However, this could be very easily argued that this is a holdover of scientific materialist thought from the 1800s that quantum physics is poking holes in. So that last point is probably a matter more for physicists and philosophers, and medicine should probably just follow Galen's example and stay in its own lane and say it doesn't know and it doesn't need to know in order to treat someone. Now, an argument could be made that this early psychological model was pigeonholing and not identifying or solving actual psychological problems, and maybe through its pigeonholing actually creating more. And that's probably fair from a certain point of view. But we should also keep in mind that psychology, as the sophisticated field it is now, really didn't even exist until 100 years ago. And I think it probably took so long to develop because you need specific circumstances. For example, you likely need the intersection of the devoted time of a specialist, de-emphasis of religion, accumulation of general and specific knowledge, societal upheaval, large patient body, and the end of ritual, religious, or shamanic forms that would make it a necessity to develop the field of psychology to begin with. I also think you need a population large enough to create some degree of anonymity in which the patient and the doctor can both shed the defensive posturing of identity and consequence to allow intimate sharing. So it's really no wonder that it didn't come about until recently. But to its credit, what humoralism does do in regards to psychology is it does identify symptoms arising in body form and function and group them into categories and accurately point out correlates of physical and functional physiologic state as it intersects with psychology. It's kind of a no-brainer that the choleric person, somebody who has yellow bile, has a rapid pulse, flushed face, bad breath, heartburn, and is also irritable and prone to mania. And it's not a stretch to see a person who has a low appetite, is on the heavier side, has a duskiness to the face, has low energy, and has loose bowels, also tends to fatigue and a kind of melancholy. And insofar as you have a physical state that correlates to a mental state, those are recognized as co-arising patterns, which implies that if you change one, you can change the other. Take, for example, someone who has a lot of yellow bile. They have bad breath, rapid pulse, heartburn, explosive and smelly bowels, and they're irritable. It's not unlikely their herbal formula would have some form of something like berberine in it, in conjunction with other herbs, of course. And that berberine is going to have an anti-inflammatory effect, an antipyretic effect. It drops body temperature. It astringes the bowels to treat diarrhea at the same time as it is antimicrobial to treat the explosive and smelly quality of the stools. But berberine also has a sedative effect, so you are affecting the mind by treating the body. By the same token, a phlegmy person who is fatigued, has loose and cold bowel movements, feels cold and clammy, has no appetite, and also tends toward depression is going to feel terrible taking anything with berberine in it. They are going to respond to hot and dry herbs like ginger and cinnamon. Those acrid herbs, those hot herbs, will reignite the sympathetic nervous system to increase digestive tone, increase metabolism, stimulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis to boost energy, and suddenly the digestion comes back online at the same time that the person feels lighter, happier, and more energetic. So this is very useful in that it identifies the influence of body on mind and mind on body, and how these are co-occurring experiences. That being said, this model is not going to address trauma in any way, shape, or form. It's not going to address underlying self-belief. It's not going to address family of origin story and generational trauma. This model is not about understanding personal narrative. And now we've finally, suddenly come to the end. We've talked about all of the stages of Pepsis and Genesis, the humors, the vital spirits, what governs what, the organs, and how the organs work together as coordinated organ systems. We've even talked about psychology. That's a ton of info. So if you've made it this far, thanks. I appreciate it. And if you want to hear more, like ancient humoral herbal diagnosis and treatment, specific formulas and recipes, be sure to like and subscribe for more to come. Thanks.